They sent 1,000 warriors. Knights in armor made from metals that don't exist on Earth. Soldiers trained for 300 years. Weapons powered by entire star systems. Every single one of them failed. And then one man walked inches. No armor. No special training. No alien technology. Just a pair of dirty hands, a worn-out jumpsuit, and a small blue and yellow can that every American keeps under their kitchen sink. WD-40. That's right. The same thing you spray on a squeaky door hinge. The same can sitting in your garage right now. That tiny, ordinary can did something that 1,000 elite alien warriors could not do in 300 years of trying. But here is what nobody talks about. It wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't magic. What this one human did that day would change how an entire alien civilization looked at mankind forever. It would shake the foundations of a galactic empire. And it would save a princess that everyone had already given up on. 3 things are going to shock you in this story. The first is what was actually trapping her. The second is why every warrior failed. And the third is what happened the moment that WD-40 made contact with the machine. Let me show you exactly how this happened. His name was Jake Calloway. He was 34 years old. He had grease permanently stained into the lines of his knuckles. His boots had holes in them. His truck back on Earth had 200,000 miles on it and burned oil every 3 days. He was not a hero. He was not special. He had never fired a weapon in his life. He had never been in a fight. He had failed high school algebra twice and barely graduated. But Jake Calloway could fix anything. That was the one thing people always said about him. Give that man a broken machine and a few minutes, and somehow, some way, he would figure it out. It didn't matter what it was. Diesel engines, hydraulic presses, old farm equipment held together with wire and hope. Jake had a gift for understanding how things worked. Not from books, not from training, just from years of lying under broken machines and thinking. He had been working at a deep space maintenance station for about 8 months when it happened. The station was called Relay Point 7. It sat at the edge of what humans called the outer corridor. It was a boring job, mostly fixing cargo ships that came through for fuel and repairs. The pay was decent. The hours were long. The coffee was terrible. Jake didn't complain much. He just worked. That morning started like every other morning. He woke up at 5. He drank his terrible coffee. He pulled on his jumpsuit. He grabbed his toolbox and walked down to Bay 3, where a human cargo hauler had come in the night before with a busted hydraulic coupling. Standard job. 2 hours tops. He was already thinking about lunch. Then the alarms went off. Not the small alarms. Not the routine maintenance alerts he heard every other day. These were the deep alarms. The ones that made the whole station vibrate. The ones that meant something very serious was happening somewhere in the facility. Jake stood up from under the cargo hauler and looked around. Every other worker in the bay had already stopped what they were doing. They were all staring at the main corridor entrance. Through the thick reinforced viewport on the bay door, Jake could see flashing red emergency lights flooding the hallway. Then his communicator buzzed. Station Commander Voss's voice came through. Hard and tight. All NO and essential personnel report to lockdown zones immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat. This is not a drill. Jake didn't move toward the lockdown zone. He moved toward the viewport instead. What he saw made him forget about the hydraulic coupling, the coffee, and lunch entirely. Coming down the main docking corridor were soldiers, but not human soldiers. These were Valkyrie warriors. Jake had seen them before at a distance, but never this close and never this many. They were tall, nearly 8 feet. Their armor was deep black with silver markings that shifted like liquid when they moved. They carried weapons that hummed with a sound you felt in your chest more than your ears. There were at least 40 of them. And in the middle of that formation, surrounded on all sides, was the most extraordinary thing Jake had ever seen in his life. She was walking but barely. Her steps were small and careful, like every movement cost her something. She wore long robes of pale silver blue that dragged along the floor. Her skin was the color of a clear winter sky. Her hair was long and white and moved like it had a life of its own. Her eyes were closed. Even from across the corridor through a thick viewport, Jake could see that she was beautiful in a way that made the word beautiful seem completely inadequate. He also saw something else. Around her wrists and ankles were thick bands of dark metal. They were connected by shimmering energy threads that pulsed with a faint greenish light. They weren't hurting her, but they were holding her. Not physically. Jake could tell she wasn't being dragged. She was being contained. Whatever those bands were, they were the reason her steps were so small. They were suppressing something inside her. Jake had no idea who she was. He had no idea what she was. He just stood there at that viewport with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched as 40 of the most powerful warriors in the known galaxy escorted one girl down a hallway. And something in the back of his mechanic's brain started quietly working on a problem he didn't even know he had yet. By noon, the entire station knew who she was. Her name was Seraphil, Princess of the Valkyrie Empire, daughter of High Emperor Drethos III. The Valkyrie were one of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy. Their empire stretched across 47 star systems. Their military had never lost a war in recorded history. Their technology was so advanced that most other species couldn't even understand the basic principles behind it. And their princess was trapped. Not by an enemy, not by a rival empire, by a machine. Jake pieced the story together slowly through whispered conversations in the maintenance bay and fragments of intercepted station communications that his bunkmate Doris was very good at accessing without permission. 300 years ago, a Valkyrie scientist had built a containment device. The device was meant to store and regulate a particular type of energy that the Valkyrie called Veil. It was the energy that certain members of their royal bloodline could produce naturally from their own bodies. In large amounts, Veil energy could heal entire planets. It could power star drives. It could stop wars. In the wrong hands, it could also level cities. The scientist built the device to protect the royal family. A failsafe. If a member of the royal bloodline ever produced too much Veil energy too quickly, the device would automatically activate and lock itself around them. It would regulate the flow, keep them safe, keep everyone else safe. The problem was the locking mechanism. It was designed to be opened by a specific key, not a physical key, an energy signature, the exact opposite frequency of the Veil energy inside. Only another royal could produce it, so the device could only be unlocked by a family member standing directly beside the locked person and channeling the correct release frequency. Simple enough. Except 300 years ago, the royal bloodline had fractured during a civil war. The branch of the family that carried the correct counter-frequency had been lost. Not killed. Lost. Scattered across the galaxy during generations of conflict and intermarriage, until the pure counter-frequency no longer existed in any living Valkyrie. And then 2 weeks ago, young Princess Seraphil had experienced a Veil surge. Nobody knew exactly why. Reports were unclear. Some said it happened during a ceremony. Some said it was triggered by an emotional event. Whatever the cause, the ancient device had activated exactly as designed. It had locked onto her, and now she was trapped inside it. The bands around her wrists and ankles were the external components of the device. The main housing was a large machine that the Valkyrie had been transporting her in. It was sitting right now in docking Bay 9 of Relay Point 7 because the ship carrying it had suffered a navigational failure and been forced to stop for emergency repairs. The Valkyrie warriors with her were not her captors. They were her protectors. 40 of the best soldiers in the Empire assigned to guard her, while their engineers worked to free her. Those engineers had been working for 2 weeks. They had tried everything. They had tried resonance unlocking. Failed. They had tried quantum frequency reversal. Failed. They had brought in 12 of the greatest scientific minds in the Valkyrie Empire. All failed. They had even attempted to physically dismantle the outer casing of the device. That had triggered secondary locks that made the situation worse. The machine was designed to resist forced entry. The more you pushed it, the tighter it held. And there was a time limit. Seraphil could survive inside the containment field for approximately 45 more days. After that, the device's internal energy regulators would begin to fail. The veil energy, with nowhere to go, would start to feed back into her body. The results of that were not something the Valkyrie engineers described in detail. But the expressions on their faces when asked said everything. Jake heard all of this and went back to fixing the hydraulic coupling. It wasn't his problem. He was a mechanic. From Earth, from a small town in Ohio, where the biggest emergency most weeks was a combine harvester breaking down during harvest season. He told himself to stay in his lane. He lasted about 4 hours. It was the sound that got him. Late that evening, Jake was walking back from the station cafeteria when he passed the corridor outside docking Bay 9. The Valkyrie had sealed the bay. 2 guards stood at the entrance. Big, still, completely uninterested in one small human mechanic walking past with a tray of mediocre pasta. But through the sealed bay door, Jake heard something. It was faint, barely there, like something at the very edge of hearing. A low rhythmic clicking sound. Regular, patient, almost like a heartbeat. Jake stopped walking. His brain had already started before he gave it permission. He knew that sound. Not the exact sound, but the category of sound. It was the sound of a mechanical component that was stuck. Not broken. Not damaged. Stuck. There was a difference. Broken things made grinding sounds. Cracked sounds. Wrong sounds. Stuck things made patient sounds. Repetitive sounds. Like they were still trying to do what they were built to do, but something was preventing them. Jake stood in that corridor for 3 full minutes just listening. Then he walked back to his quarters. He sat on his bunk and stared at his toolbox for a long time. Inside that toolbox, buried under torque wrenches and electrical tape and a spare set of socket heads, was a blue and yellow can. He always carried one. Had since his first job at 16 working at his uncle's garage in Dayton. His uncle had told him once that WD-40 wasn't just a lubricant. It was a philosophy. When something is stuck, you don't force it. You don't break it. You help it move the way it was designed to move. Jake picked up the can and turned it over in his hands. Then he put it back. Then he picked it up again. The next morning, he did something that probably should have gotten him arrested. He walked up to the senior Valkyrie engineer stationed outside Bay 9. The engineer's name, according to the station manifest, was something that translated roughly into English as Commander of Technical Solutions. Jake just called him Tech in his head. Tech was 7.5 feet tall. He had 4 arms. His eyes were completely silver. He had not slept in approximately 11 days based on the look of him. Jake walked up to him and said, "I think I know what's wrong with it." Tech looked down at him the way a person looks at a small child who has just announced they can fly. Jake was used to that look. He got it a lot. He kept talking. He explained what he had heard. The clicking. The rhythm of it. He explained what that pattern meant from a mechanical standpoint. He explained his theory that the locking mechanism wasn't actually broken or blocked by the energy field. It was stuck, physically stuck, at a molecular level. 300 years of NONUs. Metal components that had never been intended to activate sitting dormant, and then suddenly snapping into place. The energy field was real. The veil lock was real. But underneath all of that alien technology, there was still a physical mechanical component. And physical mechanical components could seize up, could fuse at contact points, could lock into place not because of energy, but because of friction. Tech stared at him for a very long time. Then he said, in carefully translated English, that 14 of the greatest engineering minds in the Valkyrie Empire had analyzed this device for 2 weeks, and none of them had suggested anything remotely like that. Jake nodded and said he understood. Then he held up the WD-40 can and explained what it did. The silence that followed lasted about 30 seconds. Then Tech said something in Valkyrie that the translation system rendered as a phrase that meant approximately, "This is either genius or the stupidest thing I have ever heard in 40 years of engineering." Jake said, "Yeah, people say that to me a lot." Tech looked at the can for another long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the bay door. He didn't say come, but he didn't say stop either. Jake followed. The inside of Docking Bay 9 looked like a cathedral designed by someone who had never seen a cathedral, but had heard one described over a long-distance radio signal. The ceiling was high. The lighting was low and amber. Along the far wall sat the machine. Jake had imagined something complicated, something enormous, something that screamed alien technology with every surface. The machine was actually not that large, about the size of a refrigerator, maybe a little bigger. It was made of a dark copper-toned metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was covered in panels of carved geometric shapes, hexagons mostly, interlocking and precise. At the center of the main panel was the mechanism, a circular housing with concentric rings, and at the very center of those rings, a small cylindrical component. Standing beside the machine was Princess Seraphil. She was exactly as Jake had seen her through the viewport. Small, careful with her movements. The bands were still on her wrists. The energy threads still pulsed that faint greenish light. Up close, the effect of her presence was even more striking. She wasn't just beautiful in a visual sense. There was something about being near her that made the air feel different. Quieter somehow, like standing near a mountain lake. She looked at Jake. Jake looked at her. He looked at her bands. He looked at the energy threads. He followed them visually back to the machine. He walked closer. He crouched down in front of the central mechanism. The clicking was louder now, clear and steady. He looked at the cylindrical component at the center of the concentric rings. It was turning, slowly, so slowly you could barely see it move. But it was moving, or trying to move, because every few seconds in its rotation it would catch. Stop for just a moment. Click. Then continue. Something was resisting it. Jake reached out and touched the outer ring of the mechanism with 2 fingers. Just rested them there. Feeling. Behind him, 12 Valkyrie engineers made a collective sound of alarm. He felt the vibration through his fingertips. The ring was trying to turn. Very slightly. Very slowly. But where the inner and outer components met there was resistance. Not electrical. Not energetic. Physical. Metal against metal. 300 years of molecular bonding at the contact surfaces. He stood up. He turned around. 12 Valkyrie engineers and 40 armed warriors were all staring at him. Some with scientific curiosity. Some with barely contained alarm. Some with expressions that did not translate well, but probably meant something between disbelief and offense. Commander Tech stood at the front. Waiting. Jake held up the WD-40 can. He said, "The contact surfaces between the inner cylinder and the outer ring housing are fused. Not from the energy. From age. The mechanism was never activated in 300 years. When it finally snapped, shut, the physical components locked at the contact point. Your energy solutions have been trying to override the veil lock. But the veil lock is working fine. It's waiting for the right frequency. The problem is the frequency can't work because the physical mechanism underneath it can't turn. You've been trying to unlock a door that isn't locked. It's just stuck." Tech translated this for the senior engineers. There was a very long conversation in Valkyrie that Jake couldn't follow. Then one of the other engineers said something that Tech translated as, "He is describing a phenomenon we have theoretical model for, but dismissed as too elementary to be the primary failure mode." Jake said, "Yeah, that's usually how it goes." He knelt back down in front of the machine. He positioned the nozzle of the WD-40 can at the contact point between the inner cylinder and the outer ring. The precise gap where metal met metal, where 3 centuries of molecular bonding had built up one microscopic layer at a time. The room was completely silent. Even the ambient hum of the station seemed to pause. He pressed the nozzle. The familiar smell of WD-40 filled the air of an alien docking bay for the first time in the history of the universe. And then he waited. 30 seconds passed. Nothing happened. One of the engineers behind Jake made a sound that needed no translation. Jake didn't move. He had done this 1,000 times. You spray it. You wait. You give the penetrating oil time to work into the molecular gaps. You don't rush it. You don't force it. You just wait and let chemistry do what chemistry does. 45 seconds. Tech shifted his weight. His forearms crossed and uncrossed. 1 minute. Jake heard one of the warriors behind him say something quietly to another. Whatever it was made the second warrior snort. Jake still didn't move. 1 minute and 20 seconds. Then, the clicking changed. It was subtle, just a fraction of a change in the rhythm. The interval between the catches got slightly longer. The resistance in the sound shifted from sharp and brittle to something smoother. Quieter, like a key that doesn't quite fit suddenly finding the groove. Jake felt it through the floor before he heard it fully. A very slight change in vibration. He pressed the nozzle one more time. One careful, precise application at a slightly different angle, getting the fluid into the secondary contact surface on the far side of the cylinder housing. Then he stood up and stepped back. For exactly 7 more seconds, nothing happened. Then the inner cylinder turned. It didn't lurch. It didn't snap. It turned with a smooth and patient rotation that it had been trying to complete for 300 years. 1 full revolution. Then 2. The concentric rings around it began to respond, each one picking up the motion in sequence, like a clockwork mechanism finally remembering what it was built to do. The energy threads connecting Seraphal's bands to the machine changed color, from green to a deep warm gold. The bands on her wrists opened. They didn't break. They didn't fall. They simply opened, hinging outward in a precise and deliberate motion. The bands at her ankles did the same a moment later. All 4 opened simultaneously. The energy threads dissolved. The gold light faded. Seraphal stood completely still for a moment. Then she took a breath. Not a small breath. A full, deep breath like someone who had been breathing through a straw for 2 weeks and had just been allowed to breathe normally again. Her shoulders dropped. The careful, rigid way she had been holding herself since Jake had first seen her through that viewport simply released. She stood straighter, taller, her eyes opened fully for the first time. They were extraordinary. Deep amber at the center burning to pure gold at the edges. Like looking at a star through amber glass. She looked at her hands. She turned them over. She flexed her fingers slowly. Testing, checking, making sure what she was feeling was real. Then she looked at Jake. He was still holding the WD-40 can. The 40 warriors had all gone completely still. The 12 engineers were absolutely silent. Tech was not moving. The entire bay had the quality of a held breath. A moment suspended between what had been true for 300 years and what was now true instead. Seraphil said something in Valkyrie. Tech translated it quietly. She said, "You heard it." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. So he just said, "Yes." She said something else. Tech translated again. 14 of our greatest minds. 12 engineers. 40 warriors. 300 years of failure. And you heard it. Jake looked at the WD-40 can. He looked back at her. He said, "It's just what I do." She walked toward him. Every warrior in the room tensed. She stopped directly in front of him. She was taller than him by a few inches. She looked at him with those gold and amber eyes for a long moment. Then she said one more thing. Tech translated it very carefully, as if he wanted to get every word exactly right. She said, "In 300 years, no one listened to the machine. You listened. That is not a small thing. In our language, there is a word for someone who hears what others cannot. The word is Valkin. It means one who understands the language of broken things. My people have not used that word in 400 years. We will use it again. For you." Jake stood in an alien docking bay on a space station at the edge of the known galaxy. He was still holding a blue and yellow can of WD-40. He had grease under his fingernails. His boots still had holes in them. And an alien princess had just given him a title that hadn't existed in 4 centuries. He looked at the can one more time. Then he said, "I'm going to need this back. I've still got a hydraulic coupling to finish in Bay 3. Here is the part nobody tells you." 3 months after that day, Jake was officially recognized by the Valkyrie Empire. Not as a diplomat, not as a soldier, as a Valkin, a title written into their imperial record for the first time in 400 years. But there is one more detail that changes everything. The Valkyrie engineers later confirmed that the theoretical model for mechanical seizure at the contact surface had existed in their scientific database for over 200 years. 200 years. The solution had been documented. It had simply been dismissed as too basic to apply to a device of that complexity. The most advanced civilization in 47 star systems had the answer in their own library. They just couldn't see it. Sometimes the person who fixes what nobody else can isn't the most powerful person in the room. They're just the one who actually listened. If this opened your eyes to what ordinary people are truly capable of, the next story will take that idea even further. Let's bring it back to where we started. 1,000 elite warriors. 300 years. 14 of the greatest scientific minds in a galactic empire. All of them failed. And one ordinary human mechanic from Ohio, with a can from the hardware store, succeeded. Not because he was stronger. Not because he was smarter in a traditional sense. But because he listened. Because he paid attention to something small that everyone else considered beneath their notice. Jake didn't save the princess with power. He saved her with patience and presence, and the knowledge that broken things always tell you what they need. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. That is the most human thing in this entire story. And it is the most powerful thing too. If this story hit you the way we think it did, drop a comment below and tell us one word that describes Jake. Just one word. We want to see what you say. If you want more stories like this one, where ordinary humans do extraordinary things in extraordinary places, hit subscribe right now, because we have 3 more stories in this series that will completely blow your mind. The next one makes this one look like a warm-up. Don't miss it.